that slide before, it was not unusual. It was in fact, it was the norm for the Anglo-American countries in terms of how early childhood programs were offered. But now we're seeing different policy trends. And this is largely due, I must say, to the work of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is the world's richest countries, of which Canada is a member. And they did a very extensive review of the early education programs in a number of their member states. And they came out with what they call some policy lessons. And they've shared those with policymakers who are members of the OECD. And they looked at it in 3 areas, and that's across the top: governance, policy, the workforce, curriculum, and parents. And their lessons around governance was that if you actually want to address issues of access and quality, somebody has to be in charge. So you do need a ministry that are an entity which has the lead for early education and care, and that they should merge the functions of everybody who's involved so that there is a common policy framework, there's a common approach, and there's actually an ECE shop, policy shop, which is composed of people who really know about early education and care. And that this is an area that actually needs dedicated funding, dedicated, stable, long-term funding, not funding that comes, that you apply every year. You can't do the sort of community planning, social planning. You can't make those differences in community when you've got to apply year after year after year, and the funding might come or might not come, or it hasn't changed in amount in the last decade. That you need a policy, and this is interesting, that more and more jurisdictions are looking at the first tier of learning as not being 0 to 3 or 0 to 4 or 0 to 5, but 0 to 8. Really that time in a child's life where they make the switch from learning to read to reading to learn. And that that first tier is there. A lot of attention is paid to quality, that you have a research and evaluation component, and that we reduce transitions. When you think about the number of transitions that children go through in terms of their programming between, by the time they hit kindergarten, several different transitions, and often, big differences in approach to their programming between, when they attended a child care program when they were 4, than what is expected of them when they turn 5 and are in kindergarten. Much more attention is being paid to the ECE workforce in terms of assuring that they are actually trained in early childhood. Narrowing the qualification gaps. Often there's a big qualification gap between the folks who teach kindergarten, the folks who work in other community-based programs like childcare and family support programs. That recognizing that this is an area which needs ongoing professional development, that this is a field that changes daily, and that staff need the most up-to-date information. And this was found to be very important, is actually recognizing the important work that this sector does. The idea of having a curriculum, you should have one. This is relatively new. We'll see that. It wasn't very long ago that we didn't have curriculum for many of our early childhood programs. And the idea that these are living docs. It's not that you develop a program and then it sits there and you look at it 10 years later. That these are really programs that documents that need to be lived. And then finally looking at parents. So what can we do to improve access? And jurisdictions are looking at very different ways. Some are bringing this, the access to schooling, lowering it to include children 3 and 4 years old. They're putting, ceilings on what fees are and providing more support. And a big emphasis now on the fact that early childhood programs, including kindergarten, shouldn't be a place where you drop the kid at the door and parents aren't welcomed in. That in fact that these are family programs, and that they really do need this open door policies. So when we look at it more on a Canadian context, we can see some of the movement that's taken place. So ECE under common ministry, we now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the, and this is, I'm sorry, this is only the provinces that are showing here. If we were showing the territories, the Northwest Territories would be there as well. Is there a common supervisory unit? You see what's happening there. Is there a common policy framework for all early years programming? We're looking at it there. And then what's happening on the ground? May not be such a big issue in the Yukon, but for bigger provinces with a more scattered population, it becomes a big issue. What we're seeing is that full-day kindergarten is now the norm. When we did this, the 2007 study, only 3 jurisdictions in Canada had offered full-day kindergarten. Now the majority of jurisdictions do, and now 80% of 5-year-olds now attend a full-day program. We're seeing schools get much more proactive in including 4-year-olds in their programming. Ontario is moving to universal junior kindergarten for all 4-year-olds. That should be in place by 2015, and 4-year-old kindergarten is under consideration in Quebec. Here I'm missing it. The Ministries of Education in Ontario, BC, and the Yukon support school-based programs for parents and preschoolers. That's your Learn Together program there. And this is almost, as I've seen, almost all programs have developed a curriculum frameworks for early childhood that's based on play. And again, that was very different. When we were talking to kindergarten teachers in 2006, we would hear that if they wanted to bring plasticine into their classrooms, that they had to make sure that it was going to be forming letters or numbers, right? And now the curriculum, the kindergarten program curriculum frameworks are guided by play, and the Ministers of Education just released a paper which recognizes play as being essential to the first tier of learning. So, in a relatively short time, a big difference. And it's a big difference because it's really important to the way that young children learn and grow. But it's also important for the field because it means that we're not as fragmented. It means that we don't have these very different approaches, or we're not required to have these very different approaches about how we react to young children and families. Again, we looked at that learning continuum going through to grade 3. A lot of attention has been paid to the status of the early childhood workforce, and I know that you and the Yukon have done a lot of work on that. The first early years study in 1999 called for a population monitoring tool that was developed. It's now the early development instrument. It's used in many parts of, in most of Canada. I know it's being used here in the Yukon and really around the world. And we're maintaining for accountability. The jurisdictions are reporting out on their investments. So when we looked in 2006, one of the things that the OEC did is give Canada a spanking for the very low levels of investment that it had in early childhood education and care, that we were of all of our OECD partners, we were the least likely to invest in ECE. Our kids were the least likely to attend an ECE program. But what we're seeing now is actually that in 2006, across the country, federal and provincial governments devoted about $3.5 billion to early education and care. Now it's 7.5. So it's more than doubled. It's not the 15 billion that the OECD suggests that we put into this area, but it's still a big boost. And I'm happy to say that when we look at the 2013 budgets across the country, that although jurisdictions may see the needs to cut in other areas, no jurisdiction has cut in this area. No one has cut early childhood education care. In fact, many have increased their investments in early childhood education care, even if they're having difficulties. So this is looking at ECE as a percentage of your total budget. So that is like what you're spending on kindergarten, what you're spending on childcare, what you're spending on programs like the Learning Together. So it gives you a comparison. Again, as I said, in 2006, the OECD found a small number of children. About 25% of kids were regularly attending an ECE program, and this is 2 to 4-year-olds. We haven't included 5-year-olds because most 5-year-olds were already in kindergarten. We haven't included, infants because they're not very likely to attend anyway. And so across the country, from 25% of kids regularly attending an ECE program, we're now up to about 52%. And as you can see, the Yukon is above the national average. So those are your children that are attending kindergarten, pre-K, Aboriginal Head Start, Learning Together, and in your group child care programs. So you're well on your way. Again, more attention to monitoring. Here's EDI. This was our, out of the 2011 report. If we were to show you this map today, you would see that the Northwest Territories, Quebec, Newfoundland, and Nova Scotia have all agreed to do regular use of the EDI. At this point, they had only field tested it. And so this then brings us to the early education report, and if I can give you some caveats about that, is when you do comparisons across Canada, it's a difficult thing to do. We do not have, as you all know, really a national framework for early education and care. Each jurisdiction keeps its own numbers, and you all keep your numbers in a very different way, making life for us researchers very, very difficult. But we do our best. So what we did is we took the OECD's policy lessons and applied them to a Canadian context and looked at benchmarks. So what was reasonable for jurisdictions in Canada to have achieved? Because when we get compared internationally, we barely make it onto the radar screen. So it doesn't become a very useful tool for policymakers or for the sector who really feels like we're running as fast as we can and we're not getting anywhere. So we really wanted to be able to provide a tool which allowed jurisdictions to see where they lined up in comparison to one another. So the first thing that we looked at was governance. Is there a coherent governance structure? Is there a common policy framework? Is early childhood divided across multiple sectors? We looked at funding. Is it at a reasonable level to provide reasonable access and quality? Is it so we see there? We looked at access. What is the percent? Do at least 50% of kids attend an early childhood program? Are there policies in place to ensure that children with special needs also have access to early childhood? The next one looks at the learning environment. Is there how are staff compensated? What's the training levels? Is there a curriculum in place? You look there. And the final one was monitoring. So out of a 15-point scale, we see that Quebec comes in first at 10. PI is only behind at about 9.5. Again, this was in 2011. We will be putting the report out again in 2014, and you're already going to be seeing some real movement on those in these areas, as again we see that with the funding, jurisdictions really start to pay important attention not only to what they spend but how they spend, and trying to ensure that they spend smart. Sorry, that's the final. You probably thought my math was out there. Yes, okay, that's the final numbers. So what the report does is it provides a snapshot. It allows, I said, it allows jurisdictions to compare themselves to their neighbors. It doesn't say that there's only one way to get to 15, because if you look at Quebec and you look at PI, they took very different routes. What we know from this is that also that it can happen fast. Because again, if we had done this in 2006, it would have been a very different story there as well. We have the example of PI that in 3 short years really flipped its early education system around from what was largely a market-driven, commercial-dominated sector into one that's highly publicly managed. PI had no school-operated kindergarten. It now has a full-day kindergarten offered by ECEs. And that's perfect timing because I'm right there. This is a doc that you should be aware of. It was put out by the Association of Canadian Deans of Education. I'm saying that it's important because these are the folks that train the next generation of school educators and policymakers. And for those of us, and I'm from the child care side of early education, we tend to be suspicious of education for its rigidity and its bureaucracy. And sorry, Minister, those sorts of things. We're very worried that if ECE ends up with education, that they'll push those academic requirements down on younger and younger kids. And what this is saying is, no, that's not the case. That really play-based learning, those rich learning, nurturing environments really have to be at the core of training for the next generation. And what we find in in our own work in Canada with the McCain Foundation and work that we were involved in Ontario, advised on in Australia and the UK, is that when early education and childcare merge, that the big difference doesn't happen in childcare, the big difference happens in education. That in fact, education gets more responsive, it gets more nurturing. Schools tend to open up their doors more to invite families in. They tend to become more family centers than places where kids go and the doors are closed between 9 and 3. So that we have this, so what we really have, and next to health, most of our budgets go to education, right? So what policymakers are thinking about as they move forward is whether to they all agree that we need to build in this area. They all know the brain story. They're excited, but it's then in a policy way, how do you move forward? And do you move forward by building onto your existing childcare, or do you use the asset that you already have in public education? And those are the choices that are yours to make, depending on what your circumstances are. My final word to you is, if you want the complete study, you can get it there. It's online. It's downloadable. We do provide something at the Atkinson Center at Oising. This is an early education monitor, and this is where we track the latest research, the latest policy developments, both in Canada and around the globe, if you want to check with that. And if you have any questions for me, you can get me there. Thank you very much for being so attentive through a long and dense